there's this emphasis on "jag kan gå" itself. I can do it myself all the time. I think being outside in all weathers has helped them again be quite hardy. When I see friends' children from the UK or family from the UK, there's a lot of tears when we all force everyone out in the sleet. And my kids are kind of all right with it. It's just normal to them, and they see, they're very aware of like, oh, this is good for us. It's good for our mood. Everyone gets along better. We feel better after we've been outside, even if we don't really feel like it at the time. And because they all start school so much later as well, so not till they turn 6, there is much less pressure. And as a journalist, I was kind of horrified at the idea of my children not learning to read or write till often 8 in Denmark, which is sounds bananas when you come from the UK. But actually, there's a lot of evidence now, even from London, from education experts at Cambridge University, for example, that putting pressure on children to read before they're ready doesn't help. It causes stress, causes anxiety. And so, again, I've had to put my trust and faith in the fact that the Nordics know what they're doing. In Finland, they don't start till they turn 7. And Finland's education system is sort of the talk of the world. It's meant to be the pinnacle we're all aiming for. And OECD studies show that by the age of 15, the Nordic countries, children are at the same level or overtaking their peers. Children in Finland are doing better than kids in the UK and the US. So they all get there in the end, but they're less stressed and happier as they go. So it's been just a sort of a paradigm shift to come out of the high pressure environment that I grew up in, that I worked in London, and just see that there is another way of life and that is possible.
I think that's so true, isn't it? Because we put them under, and I suppose it's other parents do that to other parents as well. You sort of everyone puts you and yourselves and your young ones under pressure to sort of hit various markers at various times. And children's developmental patterns, depending on which child it is, are so very different and so very varied. And they get boxed into a particular category of type of child, don't they, so early on in the British system. And maybe that isn't the answer. I mean, I know how hard it is to get my daughter to sit down with me and actually read. She's 8. She's 7, about to be 8. And it's impossible to get her to sit down for longer than sort of 5-10 minutes in any one sitting, and to try and do it more than 3 times a week is almost an impossible ask. It's really, really hard to do. But you know that if they loved it, if they really craved it and they wanted to do it, that's half the battle. And I guess forcing them to do something much earlier than they feel ready to do is why we have such a battle on our hands when we sit down and ask them to actually read to us.
Yeah, I think you're right. And certainly the way teachers here have explained it to me is that by the time you are maybe 8 or 9, there are things that you're interested in. So then, as you say, you have that motivation to learn. Whereas, I mean, I don't know about you, but Roger Red Hat was never that exciting. There's not much peril involved in reading these stories. So no wonder kids aren't that interested unless you are particularly studious and a massive people pleaser. Hello. But, you know, kids here don't tend to do that. They also, they don't, as well as having this respect, this idea that everyone is equal, you don't call teachers Miss or Sir, it's all by their first names. They have, they don't overpraise either. So rather than the idea that if we're not giving constant praise, that we're damaging our children's self-esteem. In the Nordic countries, and Denmark in particular, there's a sense that overpraise leads to inflated egos and a poor sense of self, and it can make them not be able to evaluate things for themselves. So they're always looking for external validation, which I don't know about you, but sounds very familiar to me and everyone I grew up with. And so this Nordic idea that you don't praise, you are loved just because it's not your results anyone's interested in, it's your process, it's how you got there, your journey, feels quite healthy. They don't criticize other children, they don't overpraise their own. Not every picture needs to go on the fridge, which it feels again like a very different way of looking at things.
Yeah, it feels very refreshing. What is the thing that you think the sort of, not the best kept secret, I suppose, but the greatest thing that you've learned parenting over there? What's the one sort of takeaway that you would share with other people and say, if you don't do anything else, just do this because it will make a huge, huge difference?
I think there is something around the kind of reframing what childhood looks like and what success looks like, so that it's not getting the top grades at school and burning out by the age of 16. It's, as you say, allowing our children to be bored, to play, to discover their own interests, to to make sure that they understand that they are loved just because, they are worthy just because. Kind of just changing the language we use around children as well. They don't call the age 2 and 3 in Denmark, they don't call them the terrible twos or three-nagers. They call them the boundary age, because pushing boundaries is normal, not terrible. And I think that makes a big difference as well. It's kind of taking that time, which in our fast-paced world and the high-pressure work environments many of us are in can feel really hard. And I completely appreciate that. But having had the luxury and the privilege to see a different way of being, the idea that you can just sort of eat, play, love, repeat, and childhood can follow along that path is hugely refreshing and much more relaxing for parents and children.
Is there evidence, is there proof that raising children this way leads to creating a group of really well-adjusted adults? I mean, is there actually proof that backs all of this up? Because it makes so much sense, but is there proof?
Annoyingly, there is also proof, I'm afraid. Yes.
Right.
All of the kind of the UNICEF data shows that, I mean, that's what first interested me in the project, I should add, is that, as you say, I've researched into happiness. I've been studying that for the last 10 years. But then I thought, well, hang on, if the Nordic countries are always coming top of these happiness polls, how are we building these Nordic people from the ground up? How do you make a Viking? And so I kind of came at it from that position, and absolutely it backs it up that children in the Nordic countries are happier than those in the UK and the US. They are less stressed. They are higher metrics of well-being. And of course, there will always be exceptions and whataboutery, and I reckon, but studies show that the children in the Nordic countries end up happier and healthier and more independent. And actually, I was just reading a new UNICEF study that children who play outside often are much happier than those who don't. And it's really basic stuff, as you say. It's the kind of thing that perhaps our grandparents would have banged on about without so much the everyone is worthy just because and the criticizing. But we kind of know this intuitively, and I think that's what really hits home, is that if we think about it, it makes sense, and the studies back it up. So it feels like a real incentive to try and do things a little bit differently where we can. And I wanted to really focus on the things that people can take away. We can't all emigrate to the Viking countries. I am still British. I'm not going to live in Denmark forever, but I wanted exportable life lessons I could take with me wherever I ended up.
And one of those things that you've taught me is something extraordinary about Bhutan. If you listen to your TED talk and you talk about happiness, and we'll talk about that now, that is the most extraordinary scenario of how they look after their community and how they measure what's important to their culture. Just share that with everybody, because if anyone hasn't seen your TED talk, I seriously urge them to watch it, because it's fascinating, and the way that you spin things so that it really captures the imagination and interest is bang on. But just talk about Bhutan, because it is extraordinary what they're doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Bhutan, back in the 1970s, the king was having an interview, I think with someone from the Financial Times of all people, and they were talking about how the country was doing. And the king said, King Wanchuk IV, he said, what's important to me is not gross national product, it's gross national happiness. And since then, every decision taken by government is filtered through the prism of, will this make people happier? And this includes happiness for individuals, but also happiness for the planet. It's this environmental prism as well. And so every policy has had to meet this criteria. And they have found in their census, that I think it's every 2 years they do, that people are reporting that they are happier, that literacy has gone up, the healthcare has improved massively, and just the fact that you can kind of twist things on its head, and that they make real decisions about things like they decided they didn't want fast food, for example. There's this sense that they can really make every decision based not on the money, but whether it is good for the people's health and happiness and the environment. So yeah, it's very inspiring, and such a different way of living to the one that most of us have become accustomed to.
I would argue that on balance, Kit Kats in moderation are not all bad.
especially the dark chocolate
maybe
ones,
other types of fast food, but maybe not Kit Kats, and other chocolates are available. But the happiness thing is fascinating because we live in this culture at the moment, like you say, it's so money motivated. It's so driven by other measurements and other ways of sort of qualifying and quantifying what success looks like. But happiness has been something that you've long researched. What has been the biggest sort of thing biggest learner that's come out for you about in your research on happiness? What's been the greatest takeaway for you?
I would say that, as you say, it's become a big thing that people talk about and people think about. And I think one little mistake we've made there is that we have started to define happiness as not being sad. And that's a problem because happiness is not something that we should be experiencing in a sort of jazz hands, rictus grin way the whole time. Happiness is delicious and beautiful, and these moments. And then we can also measure things like well-being and quality of life. Absolutely, we should be looking at those things, and work-life balance, which plays a huge part in that. But the idea that happiness is something we should be expecting all the time, that is down to the individual. I read a great quote the other day that you can't meditate your way out of a 40-hour working week without childcare. So this idea that we put it all on the individual, and if you're not happy, you're somehow broken, you're somehow wrong, when actually there are massive structural inequalities, there are massive, policy changes that are needed to help many countries to come up to a level of well-being that would offer us even the headspace to achieve higher scores on these happiness polls. So I think that's the thing, is that happiness is not the absence of being sad. Sadness is a normal human emotion that we all experience when we have loss or disappointment. And happiness as a goal, if we are thinking about it in that way, should be around well-being and contentment and a good life. Because the bad things will still, we all experience bereavements or losses in some way. So we can't shut ourselves off to that, because then we shut ourselves off to life. But pursuing the things that bring us joy and that give us a good standard of living and equality. Again, the Nordic countries, they tax very highly, but there are higher levels of equality. And we see in countries like the US that there is a far greater reported happiness in states where there is less inequality. So even if we're doing okay, but the people around us aren't, we're probably not going to feel great. So striving for equality and for a better standard of living for everyone, so that you don't have to worry your neighbour's going to rob you to put food on their table, feels quite important as well.
I think that's a fundamental lesson, isn't it, though, for the bigger picture in life, in terms of, like you say, that you can't have one thing without the other, and you have to sort of understand that there's a balance to everything in life. And when you place sort of happiness alongside or opposite sadness, as you say, is inevitable. It has that inevitability to it. And it is, as in most things in life, how you cope with something that is an adverse scenario in your world. So how do you sort of do that? How do you best manage sadness in order to be happy?
I think it's there's a lot of acceptance there. It's accepting that it is normal. You haven't done anything wrong. You're not broken. And then allowing time for it. Almost like talking about sort of what have I learned from the Danish way of life and raising children. It's coming off that treadmill for a moment to just take a breath, to exhale, to think things through. Because again, we know this intuitively. We may have been raised in a culture that's told us, don't be sad. Or if a child falls over, we say, oh, get up again, you're okay. And that's not massively helpful either. We train people from very young out of a natural understanding of their emotions. If a child is crying, they're crying. Whether or not we think what they're crying about is justified, we have to sort of meet them where they are and see, oh yeah, that happened. That must have hurt. Probably now we'll get on with our day. So I think we can do a lot to help the next generation to be a bit more in touch with their emotions and acknowledge what's happening. I think for adults, it's about giving some time and being quite kind to ourselves and not expecting maximum productivity the day after we've just been dumped or made redundant or something like that.
Which is unfortunate, because it comes to the point in the podcast when I want to ask you for a performance tip. So something that relates something that relates to people where they can go, I would be so much better if I did this every day. But I suppose what you're saying is that not to place too much expectation on yourself every day, because then you won't sort of under accomplish. You will always overachieve. I mean, is that the problem, that we sort of set the bar in the society in which we live? We perhaps set it to an unobtainable place.
I would say that's also true, but I think I will give you one tip here, is that I think, so in the Nordic countries, there's this idea that family meals are sacred. And because of the work-life balance, it's possible to do that more often. And of course, many of us are not able to do that. But I think there's so much evidence that eating a home-cooked meal with family is associated with positive health outcomes. It's really good for our mind, body, soul, everything. So if we can aim maybe for once a week to have a home-cooked meal with the people we care about, our family, gathered or blood family, I think that's a really helpful thing that kind of sets you up for the week ahead. I think that's quite a helpful one.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. It's been lovely to speak with you. Really interesting.
Thank you so much. Lovely to chat to you.